Hello and welcome to the Stories That Shape Us podcast. My name is Joanna Danielle. If you're new to this channel, I'm a counselor, speaker, and author. I work with adult survivors of childhood trauma and women who experience abuse. I have been using the podcast and this YouTube channel to talk about the serious case of allegations that showed up in the Seventh Adventist Church and in the Church of England. Today, I'm going to share why we know for sure that many people knew about Donald Kelly and ignore his crimes. And that's why he was able to go on to hurt so many more people. And here is why I know. I was reflecting this week and I thought of another case of historic abuse that happened in our church. And when the gentleman was later fired by the church, how the outcry and people were still defending him. Now, this gentleman started his reign of abuse, well, we know of in 2011. And he lasted up until 2020 before he was fired. Now, he moved from one place to another. He was restored. He was forgiven. He was rebaptized, and he went on to do it again. Now, there's some things that have come to light that I want us to consider and think about, and church leadership need to take into consideration when allegations of abuse happen. The language. And I've talked about the language that is used when, how church leaders apologize. The language that is used says a lot about how they see the abuse, right? Now, we need to call things what it is. A leader don't have sexual relations with somebody who is in their church or a young person. That's not what it is. It's assault. And if we don't call things by its name, then we're not going to treat it the way it should be treated. So it wasn't sexual relations that they had. He assaulted her. And that's what we have to say. We have to call it that name. If we don't call it that name, we're not going to treat it as that. So language is also important in reducing harm. When we're thinking about pastoral care settings like church, harm reduction, pastors and church leaders have to be really vigilant around how do I use language and how my language can harm others. So in the reports, in the letters, in the things that I see, the language is really not thoughtful. For some people, their language is not thoughtful. And so their language is creating harm. Now, when I look at Dr. Samuel Pippin, I met him many, many years ago when I was a young person going to conferences, and I met him and loved his sermons, loved his books. I had, I think, 3 of them. Loved the way he preached. He is straight down the middle. He doesn't mess about with words. He talks about no gray areas. And I was saying to my husband the other day, I said, honey, sometimes the people that you hear talking about sexual immorality, it's maybe because those are the areas that they're struggling in. I said, when you hear somebody preach dress reform only, sometimes they're struggling. But what they will do is blame their struggles on people. So somebody who is preaching about dress reform and sexual immorality, because they have their own internal struggle, they project that outward and blame women for how they dress. That's why they stumble and struggle. And whatever your views are on that, we can never blame somebody else for the way we struggle. We have to look inwards. And so the work of looking inwards is really important. And as I'm reading through the documents and the news reports and Dr. Pippin's letter of resignation from the church and the church's letter, nowhere in those reports except in the reports, and I'm going to share the link below that you can go read all this for yourself, except in the report from the counselors. Those are the only people that name it sexual assault. Nobody else did. It's called indiscretion. It's called the way he framed it when he resigned from the church, and in his letter of resignation, when his letter of resignation came, he didn't even call it indiscretion. He talked about being shamed. He talked about shaming his family. He talked about a mistake, but never once did he call it for what it was. He is notifying the church about a mistake that he made, but he never once called it what it was. He never once took ownership for what he did. Not once did he do that. And so as I'm reading through these accounts and these reports, I'm thinking about the people that was affected by it. I'm thinking about the women. I'm thinking about the young people, the young women that were harmed. Because in the very first case that happened for Pippin in Botswana, that young woman was groomed. Bless her, she had no idea what was going on. And that's why I said grooming is not just children and young people. That young woman, I think maybe in her early 20s, it sounds like, she was groomed. This man with power, this man with authority, this man who is revered, he's an excellent speaker, he's very intellectual, he's a great orator. He comes and he's offering, and I'm thinking of how many people that were responsible around this young woman and did nothing. But that's not what we're talking about here in the podcast today. I'm talking about the language that was used. He wanted to resign from the Michigan conference, which he was in at the time, with great sorrow and shame that while in his overseas travel, he had a moral fall. But not only that, so he did that. And so that happened in 2011. In 2012, the church talked about how repentant he was and how sad he was, and they were going to rebaptize him. But in couple of days before that baptism, somebody else came forward, another victim came forward and said, he did it to me too. So we know it's not, of course, it's a moral failing. It's a moral failing on his part. It's a moral failing on his part that the church enabled, that several people enabled, right? Because of who he was. And so the rebaptism didn't happen in 2012. And in September 2013, there was a defense, in 2013, September, somebody was defending their role in his rebaptism. And what these people are stressing is remorse, is repentance. But how are you going to repent from something that you've never acknowledged that you did? You never acknowledged that you did, but they said he was repentant and he was deeply sorrowful. But he never apologized. He never owned it for what it was. He called it an affair. He called it his moral failing. He called an affair. You cannot groom and harm someone and then call it an affair. It wasn't an affair. And then in September, this is not just one person. And in September 2012, another letter was written to the Michigan conference in response to that letter. And then in 2014, he was rebaptized. Now, I'm not saying don't rebaptize the man. Okay. I'm not saying don't rebaptize him. I'm not saying don't forgive him. I'm not saying any of those things. I'm saying language is important, because language helps us to, when we name something, then we can sit with the implication of the thing that we're naming. The languaging was wrong. The language gave responsibility and blame to the victim. The language suggests that it was a consensual relationship. The language suggests that they made choices to have relationships with this man, and that's not so. When somebody else is in power, when somebody has authority, spiritual authority or other authority, and they are having relations with their subordinates, they have to think really carefully about that. Is this going to be me misusing my power? Is this going to be me misusing the trust that is placed in me? And think clearly about that. Now, this man was married. He was married. He had positions in church, and he misused it. And I once again, I'm sharing this because I want us to see some parallels with how Donald Kelly's situation was dealt with because of who he was. And that's why I know that there are many people who need to take responsibility. I don't know whether or not they are brave enough to do that, to take responsibility and to say, yes, I knew. I didn't put enough import on it. He was my friend. He was intelligent. He was intellectual. We benefited from the work that he was doing, and because of that, I didn't do anything. I don't know if people are brave enough to do that. That will take a lot of courage. Now, that would be such an amazing, good Christian thing to do. It would show us that people are really connected to Christ. It would show us that their connection to Christ and conversion is happening, and it's happening in such a way that they will take responsibility. But let's continue with just the parallels with Samuel Pippin. So they rebaptized him finally. People defended their positions to rebaptize him because he showed that he was remorseful, although he didn't name the thing for what it was. So in effect, his remorse was a lie. His remorse was a lie. It wasn't true remorse, because true remorse would have said, I did it. I took advantage of these young women. I groomed them. I used my position, and I'm sorry. That would be honest, true remorse. The remorse of, I had a moral failing, I had all these affairs, that's on dishonesty. So he wasn't even being honest. And the people who were supporting him also were dishonest. They were partaking in the dishonesty because they weren't naming it. They were using language that was blaming the victims, and they were keep giving this man access. He still had access to children, to young people. He still had access. And so when we're thinking about forgiveness and somebody who is really repentant, it doesn't mean that we don't rebaptize them. It doesn't mean that we don't forgive them, but it means that we know honestly who they are and treat them accordingly. This man was a habitual groomer. He had a pattern of having inappropriate relationships with young people in his care. That is something that needed to be taken into consideration. That's what you're forgiving. You're not forgiving someone for having an affair. It's not what it was. When somebody has authority and decide to misuse that authority, not one, but repeatedly, he has a problem. If you're going to love him enough to help him deal with the problem. Sometimes you might have to love somebody and go visit them at prison. Sometimes you might have to love somebody and report them to the police. Sometimes you might have to love somebody and insist that they go to therapy that is going to be deep and extensive enough to help them heal so they don't repeat the pattern of harm that they're doing. He didn't only hurt the young people, he hurt his wife, he hurt his family, he hurt the church, people who respected him, people who look up to him. I remember the shock that went through me and many others who listened to his sermons and loved his sermons and loved his teachings, right? So it's not just one person that got harmed. But another thing to take note was that he was rebaptized and then he reoffended. He did what he was going to do anyway. He reoffended. And eventually the church had to take away his credentials, right? Now, for me, is from the very first time that brave young woman in Botswana disclosed, that is when his credentials get taken. Not how many years later. Nobody else should have been hurt. And maybe people were hurt before her, but they didn't share. But from that moment that came out, that is when he stopped having access to young people. That is when his position that he's using gets taken away. We still forgive him. We still love him. We still listen to him and his remorse. We still celebrate with him. We still rebaptize him, but we safeguard people around him. We ensure that he doesn't have access to use that level of power. For those who are his friends, make sure he goes to therapy. Not once in any of his writings, and he's an extremely intellectual man, but not once in his writing did we see where he said, I recognize this as an issue for me and I am working on it in therapy. I didn't see that. Maybe he's doing it now. But I remember, I think it was last year or the year before, it may have been the year before, I saw that there was a ministry that's based in Ghana that had him on a poster, and that ministry I know work with young people. I wrote to them and said, this gentleman is known for having inappropriate relationship with young people, kind of like the young people that you're working with. How are you giving him a platform and he has not demonstrated change? And the response to me was, we're dealing with it. But he stayed on the poster. I checked on their Facebook page yesterday, and he's still on their Facebook. He's still doing things with them. And some of the information I got back was that, they're supporting him. He doesn't have anybody. And I'm not saying ostracize, of course not. We support them. We lead them to repentance. but we are aware of who they are, and so we safeguard other people. So if you're safeguarding people, if you are aware of who people are, then you are not going to give them opportunities to work with young people when you know that that's the area that they fail in. It just doesn't make sense to me. That's not how forgiveness should also be wise. The Bible says that we should be wise. It says that we should be wise. So if we're going to be wise people, how are we wise people when we know that somebody continually slip in an area and we still put them in positions in that area for them to slip again? And it's not only that, it's the pain that it inflicts on the victims. And so I think there is a disregard for women. There's a disregard for children and young people. There's a lack of love, I think it is, for children and young people and for women, that perpetrators will continually have access. And so until somebody sit down, until many persons sit down and really study the reports that came into the church, not only in the UK, but in other parts of the world where Donald Kelly worked, until the church sit down with those reports and take some responsibility, it's going to happen again. Unfortunately, we're going to come here again. Unfortunately, more people are going to be hurt. Unfortunately, because what we're seeing, and as I said at the beginning, that language is important. Language is important. The way we phrase things is important. It really helps us understand and own what's going on. Now, I know that this is not easy. I work with people who are healing from sexual trauma. I know it's very difficult to say what the trauma is. Very difficult. I know that. But I know that I can't not say it. I have to say it. I help the people who can't say it to say it. So when you're in leadership, if you can't say it, something is wrong, and then maybe you need to sort out and heal your trauma. But when we minimize and use the wrong language, we're hurting victims. And that's why I want us to, I want the leaders to think about, how am I using language? What am I saying? Is my language dismissive? Is it harmful? I want to reduce harm. I want to reduce the hurt that people are feeling right now. I want to call abuse by its name. I want to name it abuse. It's not a moral failing. A moral failing suggests that they had an affair. When somebody's in power having relationships with younger people, it's not an affair. It's abuse. And so when we can learn from something, I think if they review the case of how the Michigan conference and the Ohio conference dealt with Samuel Pippin, then they will learn from that and the reports of how Donald Kelly was dealt with. Then the church can learn from these reports. And I know many others that didn't make the blogs, that didn't make the news. Many others can be looked at, and lots of rich lessons can be drawn so that we don't get back here where more people are hurting. Unfortunately, if this is not done, we're going to come back here again. And I believe the Adventist church around the world can use this, not just the established church, but ministries and other churches that broke away. So if all these leaders look at these and said, where can we look at these? Where can we find a common thread? Where can we ensure that this isn't happening again? Now, that this doesn't happen again. Now, I see, lots of end time sermons are happening now. Lots of people are making connections with the new US president and, end of time and the things that we should be doing. Somebody sent me a video of somebody who had a dream, and we know as Christians that Jesus is coming. We know that the world as it is going to end. We know that there's no better to this. We know that, right? And so we know that at this time, we should be living as if we believe that this event is going to happen. As Christians, we know that. We know that the signs of the time, as recorded in Matthew 24, is happening. But while that is happening, as children of God, we cannot be not wise. We cannot be harming people still in the same way with the same patterns. Now, some of the language I hear coming out of the reports around Donald Kelly is that, this is the now deceased 60s and 70s. Unfortunately, it's the same thing that's happening in 2024. The same way sexual abuse reports were dealt with by the church in the 60s and 70s, 80s, 90s is happening in the 2000s, unfortunately. And so, once again, that language that is creating distance between us and what happened, the language that is creating distance between them and the now deceased, is the same. It's language that is protective. It's language that says nothing to do with me. It's language that says, it's not language that says this shouldn't have happened, won't happen under my watch, things are going to change, this is how we're going to make things change. That's not what I'm hearing. And I hear people saying, people telling me that in their churches, safeguarding, there's this sweep of safeguarding and people, DBS checks, and people are a little bit cynical about the DBS checks. And I have to say that DBS checks are necessary. They're necessary and they're needed. But I'm also a little bit cynical about the drive on DBS checks right now. And so the church needs to do more than DBS check. The church needs to sit with their own failure to not only report, but to adequately manage and deal with people when there are allegations of abuse. So when they can call it by its name and name the thing for what it is, then they'll be able to sit with it. When they can name it, when they can sit with the discomfort of the fact that it's my colleague, it's my friend, it's somebody that I know and respect and look up to that did this, then then things will be able to change. But until then, a DBS check won't change that. It won't shift anything, So of course, DBS checks are good. Everybody who works with children need to have it. Everybody that have exposure to children need to have it. But we also need to think of a deeper cultural shift that needs to happen across the denomination around the world, because we see it in the US. We see Donald Kelly went to Jamaica. He went to Sierra Leone. I think he was in Mexico, but he just gets passed on. How many more people of reported sexual abuse are being passed around from country to country, from region to region? Somebody needs to say, this will not happen in my administration. Somebody needs to say, this will not happen while I'm president, while I'm secretary, while I'm treasurer, while I'm on the executive committees. It will not happen while I'm on this church board, while I'm first elder. It will not happen while I'm leading this church. Somebody needs to say that. Somebody needs to have their eyes open to know what grooming looks like and put things in place. Somebody needs to be prepared to hold their brothers accountable. Somebody needs to love their brothers enough so that when they do have these moral failings, and for those who are listening to the audio, moral in quotes, failings, somebody need to love their brothers enough that when they have these moral failings, that they call them out, that they hold them responsible. Can you sit with your brother? And if he's in power, can you see that he's grooming? Do you know that about him, that you can sit with him and you can walk with him to therapy and insist that he change and hold him accountable to change? Can you ensure that he doesn't go anywhere near children and young people? Can you ensure that? Can you love him enough to do that? Can you love him enough to say, I'm going to call the police. I have to call the police. Can you do that? That's why when a woman discloses abuse in church that she's not seen, she's sidelined and she's undermined. That's why a child will leave church as soon as they get to an age where where their parents can't force them anymore, because of the safeguarding failures in our church. Now, I didn't say a failure to have DBS checked. I said safeguarding failures. A safeguarding failure is very different than a failure to have a DBS check. It's a very different failure. And so our young people seeing it, they were unsafe. Things happened to them. Nobody believed, because we were protecting the good name of the church, and they've left. If you, whatever denomination you are listening to this from, and you know that your church has these failings, let us hold our churches accountable to change. Let us hold them accountable. Let us participate in the cultural shift that needs to happen in order to keep children and young people safe. Let us not have reports like Donald Kelly ever again in our lifetime. Let us not pass on a legacy of hurt to our children, so that when they are unpacking the stories that shape them, they're unpacking things that we did, how we put them at risk, and how we never kept them safe. When they're unpacking the stories that shape them, let them not see spiritual failures done by leaders of religious organizations who weren't men of moral and upright standing, who didn't have the courage to call out this kind of sin and name it so that they can be protected. Let, when they're unpacking the stories that shape them, they can see care, they see honesty, they see courage, they see integrity, they see uprightness. Let them unpack the stories and see those, so that if the world lasts and their generation is unpacking because of the legacy that they got from us, it will be a different story. Thank you for joining me in this episode of Stories That Shape Us. I hope you'll join me on the next story.